Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to welcome you here today to the Jefferson Wells Digital Events Series, Managing Technology and Security Risk in Turbulent Times. We have a wonderful presentation for you, and I'm pleased to introduce our presenter. But before we get started with today's discussion, we have a few quick housekeeping items to cover. In order to ensure your best audio and visual quality, please listen through your computer by turning on the speakers after you log into the event. During your viewing experience today, please feel free to adjust your viewing screen by clicking on the four-dot symbol in the upper right-hand corner. This webinar also qualifies for 1 CPE credit. You must participate for 50 minutes of the webinar in order to be eligible for credit, and each participant must be logged in to an individual computer in order to track your participation. There will be a series of polling questions asked throughout today's session. Please take a moment to answer the polls when they are launched on the screen. Each polling question will remain open for 60 seconds. We will be emailing CPE certificates to all qualifying attendees next week. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them by clicking on the question mark icon to open the Q&A window. If we run out of time, we'll be sure to get back to you via email and answer your questions from our presenter that way. So to begin, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our presenter for this session, Stephen Head. Stephen?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session. My name is Stephen Head, and I'm looking forward to sharing a lot of up-to-the-minute information with you. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about what I'm planning to cover today. I've divided this into three major sections, the first of which I'm titling In the Eye of the Storm. And basically, here is where I'm going to cover, where are we right now? What have we gone through over the last 9 months or so, and what are the next 6 to 9 months looking like? Secondly, I'm going to talk about what are the technology and security risks that we're facing right now. And I'm going to compartmentalize these into 10 major things that are going on right now that are putting your data at risk. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about some solutions. What are 10 things that you need to be doing right now? And then if we have time at the end, we will open it up for questions. So let's jump right in. So on the next slide, In the Eye of the Storm, first section, next slide, please. What we're seeing really since about March of this year is a convergence of multiple threats. And some of these are very obvious, very apparent. Some are more of follow-on effects from, obviously, the biggest thing in the news in 2020, of course, has been the pandemic. But the pandemic has led to other issues emerging in some cases. So in terms of the threats that we're currently looking at, pandemic, cyber attacks, we've been faced with a number of extreme weather events, and then finally civil and geopolitical instability. All of these are creating turbulence for organizations as they attempt to navigate their way through this. So as we move on into the first of these, the pandemic, and I like to liken this to a storm that is literally lasting for months. We've gone through so much change since about March of this year. Everything from sheltering in place to the number of businesses that have closed or have had to seriously curtail their operations. The lack of mobility and travel limitations that we're all now under. The impact on our supply chain and third-party service providers in some cases have been disrupted. And the fact that this is not just regional in nature, this is worldwide in its impact. So moving to the next slide, you will see here that it's not just about the pandemic, but we've also had a follow-on effect of how cyber attacks are now on the increase. And just to give you an illustrative example, last week I spoke to a CISO who was telling me that this time last year, he had an average of perhaps 18 to 20 attacks on his network on a daily basis. He said as of last week, he was up to 2,000 attacks per day. So obviously, the threat actors, the hackers, they are attempting to take advantage of this situation in which so many organizations are being distracted, and they are ramping up their attacks. And there's not just one type of hacker. There are many types. There are the nation state hackers, actual countries who are attempting to either hack into and affect our elections. In some cases, they're hacking into companies attempting to steal intellectual property, many different reasons, but you have your nation state actors. You also have your criminal underground. I mean, the criminal underground sees hacking and cyber attacks as a significant part of their business. I mean, they treat this very much as a business and have hacking teams that are very sophisticated in their efforts, to the extent that, for instance, I've been told that in the case of ransomware, that there will actually, in many cases, be a help desk for the ransomware victim that has been set up by the hacker, that if you pay your ransom, they will help walk you through how to decrypt your information. So highly, highly sophisticated. And then there are also the hacktivists. And these are people who are not motivated monetarily, but rather they have a political agenda that they are wanting to strike out and hurt organizations that they have a grudge with, that they feel is contrary to their particular belief system. Now, you also have the lone wolves, and the lone wolves are the ones that really have been most put forth in our movies and our television shows. The Kevin Mitnicks of the world, who are operating independently, and in many cases are doing it not so much for personal gain, although they can, but in many cases it's more for the thrill of being able to accomplish it, or the social status that they would be recognized by fellow hackers for what they were able to achieve. And then finally, there are the insiders. Now, these insiders could be people seeking revenge against their employer because they felt like that they were taken advantage of. Maybe top management received very hefty bonuses while people were being laid off. So these insiders, they have an axe to grind, and they feel like that they are deserving, and as a result, they in some form or fashion, engage in hacking. So on the next slide, let's also talk about extreme weather events. Obviously, this has been a record year for just hurricanes in terms of the number and severity of the hurricanes, not only in the US, but worldwide. And I thought it interesting that just today, I was hearing about the fact that several companies have encountered problems with one of their third-party service providers that's based in the Philippines, because the Philippines is currently being hit by a typhoon, and they're having to shut down operations until the typhoon passes. So it's not just local weather events. It can be a weather event on the other side of the world that can impact you locally as we become more of a global economy. So on the next slide, let's also talk about the aspect of civil and geopolitical instability. Obviously, with this being an election year, we've seen a lot of civil disobedience, but it's not just in this country. We're seeing it all over the world, in France and Germany, in Asia, geopolitical instability can have secondary effects that can affect business. If transportation routes are shut down, or if people go on strike. I know right now there's talk of trucker strikes happening in this country potentially. So, civil and geopolitical instability is something we have to be aware of. And the fact that it's like the weather, it's not just what happens here locally, but if there's events, riots happening in Hong Kong or in China or in India or Pakistan, those can impact our ability to conduct business here. So it's definitely something that we have to keep our eye on. So now let's go to a polling question on the next slide.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So we've got our first polling question here, and it reads, to what extent has the turbulence we have just described impacted your organization? Is it little to no impact? Is it we have deferred certain projects due to budgetary cutbacks? Have you had to institute furloughs, layoffs, or salary cuts? And last but not least, or have you had to implement a combination of B and C?
Okay, and we'll take a moment for all of you to provide your responses. Obviously, this is something that differs by industry, some industries being hit much, much harder. And yet, I think to varying degrees, we've all been impacted by these different aspects of turbulence that are either affecting our own companies personally or are affecting our service providers. So definitely something that is very impactful. So here are our results, and I see a preponderance of 37% of you have implemented a combination of having to defer certain projects, and in some cases having to institute furloughs, layoffs, and things of that nature. So not surprising at all. And I think some of the content that we're going to cover later is going to give you some insights into how things like the furloughs and layoffs, as well as the cutting back on projects, can have an impact. So let's move on then and go to our next section of turbulence, and what are some of the things we're seeing. And obviously, when I think about the impact on technology in terms of security risk, I think about the hacker. I think particularly about things like ransomware. I mean, a ransomware attack can cost millions, and you may think, well, but I hear that these attacks, generally the average ransom, maybe it's $200,000. But what most people don't realize is that's just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, you will have to undergo so much expense and effort in making sure that the hackers have not left behind other back doors or other time bombs that may be set to go off at a later date, that you may have to spend several times the amount of the ransom just to thoroughly examine your systems and make sure that they have been totally cleansed. So you're definitely looking here at loss of revenues. If it hits the news, you're now having to be concerned about what kind of impact is this going to be on your brand, your public image, and how is that going to then translate into stock prices or loss of your shareholder confidence. And finally, if it's egregious enough, you may also be looking at increased liability of lawsuits against your board of directors or even your management. So these are all things to be concerned about. So let's move into the next slide, and I'm going to go over 10 items that I feel like are really raising the risk in terms of what we're currently facing. And the first of these is the fact of how we're now, in most cases, all working from home. And working from home, I put this picture up to illustrate it's not necessarily the traditional single family home. You may have people sharing an apartment, working for competing firms who are now both working from home for those competing firms. So now when you think about it, you're co-locating your organization with that of another organization. Obviously laptops are a concern of, are they secure? Are they up to date on their patching? I know of a number of companies that did not have enough laptops, and so they were actually asking their employees to take their desktops home with them and work from home using the desktops. Now, the problem here is the fact that many of these desktops were not configured to work outside of the protective network environment. In fact, they did not have a built-in firewall. They were relying on the fact that they would normally be operating from inside that corporate network. And now they're operating outside the corporate network, and they may not really be sufficiently secured to operate in that manner. Add to that, in our home environment, many people have Internet of Things devices. These are network connected devices that connect to the internet through your home wireless router. So, what types of information might that be exposing, given that many of these devices, they are consumer grade, they're not commercial grade, they generally have very weak passwords, and they might potentially be used as an attack vector to go after the work that you're doing from home. And as I mentioned earlier, with your home wireless access point, who has configured that wireless access point? It's probably not an access point that was provided to you by your employer. It's probably something you picked up at Best Buy and just kept whatever the default password was, or maybe you got it from your internet provider. So, when you think about the fact that not only is your corporate connectivity flowing through that wireless router, but also if you have kids at home that are schooling from home, they are connecting to perform their schooling through that same wireless router. And how secure are their computers? And they're all flowing through the same access point. And then finally, the issue of removable media. A lot of today's access points, they have the capability for connecting to network attached storage devices. These are essentially removable storage media that can connect directly to your access points. So what does this open up in terms of potentially the ability to copy information from your laptop to that device, or vice versa? So these are things that we need to be aware of and think about. So next on the list, item number 2 is the technology challenges. I know back in March, I remember hearing about several companies, large companies, that only had the capacity for about 10% of their employees to connect via a virtual private network. And they've since done a great job of ramping it up, but they're still in some cases facing technology challenges. The bandwidth for that many people coming in remotely may really be stressing their networks. And are they taking any steps to handle that by maybe cutting back on the level of security? Because whenever you're dealing with things like firewalls, there's always an overhead component to that added security that impacts bandwidth. And we want to make sure that these companies are not cutting back on things like logging simply to try to provide better throughput. Obviously, this is also hitting third-party service providers. And, I would also mention the impact on the laptops. A lot of laptops that have been deployed to employees were not necessarily staged such that they could be able to handle things like Zoom meetings and Teams and all this other collaborative software, which is great, but it does have a certain demand component to it. And if all of your laptops are running with 4 gig or 8 gig of memory and you need 16, that's going to have an impact. And what you don't want is that the corporate reaction is, well, let's turn off certain security features on our endpoint devices like anti-malware because that's taking up memory, and we've got to free up memory so our people can do our jobs. And then finally, authentication. With everyone working from home now, you need to make sure that there is multi-factor authentication in place so that you can ensure that the person on the other end is who they say they are. So now let's go to number 3. And this next one, we've talked about, and you yourself reflected in our polling question results of, the furloughs and the layoffs, the things of this nature. And what is this doing to your control environment? Are certain controls being skipped? Are they not able to have time to review the logs because, well, the person who normally does that, they're on furlough for the next 2 weeks. So are the logs, in fact, going to sit there and nothing will happen with them because, we don't have a backup person to perform those reviews? Are security patches being applied? I mean, now we're having to patch the endpoint devices, that are sitting in these home environments. And are those patches always getting done? Or in some cases, are they being deferred because, well, we normally push out patches at midnight and most of the laptops are turned off then, so they're not being patched. So things of this nature, are backups being checked? Or again, is the person responsible for ensuring the integrity of the backup? Are they currently on furlough, or were they laid off and now their duties have been passed on to another person? And then, of course, segregation of duties. If you have fewer people doing the same amount of work, are you now in a situation where certain incompatible duties are being performed by that same person? So these are things we need to be very concerned about. So moving on now to number 4, phishing attacks. And I see phishing attacks, just the incredible and how much this has increased just here in 2020. And I know even looking at the old statistics from previous years, the statistics were saying that 90% of all cyber attacks were actually against your, through your emails. So that is, to me, kind of like a beachhead, that in terms of if an enemy is attacking, they are attacking these endpoint devices through the emails. So very important that emails are being properly filtered to keep as many of these attacks out as possible, because according to the FBI, I know a statistic from previous years was something like 1 out of 131 emails would contain malicious software, would contain an attachment that if you clicked on that attachment, it would load malware onto your laptop. Or if you clicked on the hyperlink, it would load malware onto your device. So, the idea of phishing attacks is something that you really have to focus on. And the fact that we're going through the pandemic right now, a lot of these attacks are focusing on those fears. They're having subject lines that reference the pandemic. Maybe they're talking about a new type a variant of the COVID virus, or they're talking about, hey, there's now free testing in your area, just click on this link, or they're preying on employee fears that they might be laid off by saying something about a new company severance policy, click on this attachment. And these are all preying on people's fears. And with people being remote now, they're much more susceptible to this type of attack than back when they were in the office. And if they had any doubt, they could just, walk down the hallway and ask their manager, hey, this seems very suspicious. Is this legitimate? So now let's go to number 5. And number 5 is very related, and it's social engineering. Social engineering has always been around, but now it's becoming, to me, more dangerous because of the fact that with people working remotely, they are more likely to be trusting. I mean, if someone calls them up and says, this is the company help desk, and we understand many of you have had trouble connecting, we have a patch for your computer that will really speed up its ability to work. I just need access to your computer. A lot of people would fall for that. Or it may be something like an executive calling someone up and saying, hey, where are those reports I asked for? And again, when the person is working remotely, it's not as easy to, walk down the hall and say, hey, is this legitimate or not? So social engineering, I believe, is also increasing at a very, very phenomenal rate. So now let's move on to number 6. And number 6 is the insider threat. And I alluded to this earlier, but the fact that you have employees feeling very ill at ease that are they going to lose their jobs? Are they going to get hit with a salary cut or a furlough or a layoff? And maybe in some cases they're hearing that top management got a bonus during this period. So they may feel anger against their employer and want to get even. There's also the issue of the fact that if they're fearing a potential layoff, they may start copying information, intellectual property. Maybe they're a developer and they've worked on a very sophisticated programming code for the last 6 to 9 months. They may be making a copy of that so that they can take that and leverage that at their next employer. Or in the case of a salesperson, that salesperson may be attempting to download information of customer list, vendor list that they may want to take with them to a competing employer. And so the insider threat is something we cannot discount because it's definitely very real. So now on to number 7. And number 7 is, who is guarding your information assets? I mean, we're so focused on working from home environment, we have to also think about, well, what's going on back at corporate? Is anybody monitoring the logs? Are there delays in controls being performed? And some of these I've already mentioned, but also take into account things like physical security and the fact that with not that many people at your corporate facility, is it going to be easier to walk in and nose around and maybe not be as quickly challenged because there's so few people in the building, and that creates an opening. And the fact that all of these controls, if they begin to backslide, who's looking? Is the auditor making sure that there is no loss of control? And are the auditors staying on top of this? Because the hackers are going to be looking for these weaknesses. So it's something that we really have to stay on top of. So now let's go on to number 8, and that is security upgrades and technical audits. And I was actually noticing this back in fourth quarter of last year, that there were a lot of security upgrades that we would talk to various clients about, and they had chosen to defer because they wanted to get through year end, and they were saying, well, we'll just take care of this in Q1. And the same thing with a number of technical audits, that there was a choice made to defer the technical audit, say like audit of Active Directory, for instance. No, we're going to put that off to early next year. Well, then COVID hit this year, and now these security upgrades, these technical audits have once again been delayed. So we're falling further and further behind here. So it's something that we have to be cognizant of and realize that at a time when organizations are under increased attack, we're actually easing up on the controls from the standpoint of having better security technologies implemented, as well as staying on top of the technical audits. So this is something that is, I think, a very important challenge to companies, that if we don't get on top of this, it's going to hurt us down the road. So now let's go to the next slide, please. And third-party service providers. I mean, thus far, we've been talking about our own organizations, but so many of our organizations rely heavily on our third-party service providers. And what are they going through right now? Because they're facing the same challenges that we are. And so we have to ask the right questions. We have to ask, are our third-party service providers, are they still secure? And how do we know that? How old is our information? Was the last review of that provider a year ago, and now their security stance may be far different than it was then? And also, do we have any sole providers that we don't have any backup for if we were to lose that part, that's third-party service provider? Is there a secondary that we could fall back on, or is this going to be a single point of failure for us? And are we still doing our vendor risk assessments normally, or have we deferred those? These are things that need to happen no matter what. And if we add new service providers, are we still going through a proper vetting process? I've known of way too many, especially when it comes to cloud computing providers, that they're being fast-tracked and implemented at companies without really going through a proper security vetting. So, this is something that we need to focus on and make sure that we're not bypassing the security just to keep things running efficiently. So let's go now to number 10. And this is what we refer to as the velocity of risk. And I know, over all the years I've been involved with risk assessments and IT risk assessments, we're always talking about things like magnitude of risk, the likelihood of risk. But now, with such dramatic change occurring, we're seeing that we have to also take a look at velocity, and the fact that the risks are changing so quickly that the risk assessment that was performed, say, in the fall of last year may actually no longer be relevant, that so many risks have changed. And so many of our business processes have had to change. And when those processes change, that impacts your risk landscape. And obviously, you can't mitigate the risk that you don't even know about. So with that, I think we may be ready for another polling question. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. So as we go ahead to polling question number 2 here, what is your best estimate as to when your organization will return to normal operations and business as usual? Do you think by the end of the year, sometime in the first quarter of 2021, or possibly mid 2021 at the earliest?
Okay, so if everyone would please make a selection, obviously this is going to vary somewhat by industry, as some industries are being hit harder than others, but it's definitely something that is on everyone's mind as to at what point can we, return to some semblance of normal operations, or is this something that we really cannot see light at the end of the tunnel as of yet, because it's constantly changing. All right, we have some results here, and not entirely surprising, but it is surprising that it's very much a clear consensus that 73% of you are saying mid next year at the earliest. So mid 2021 is the earliest that you see resuming normal operations, whereas only 6% of you said by the end of this year. So clearly there is a majority, 3 out of 4 of you feel that we're going to be going through this for some time to come. So thinking about that picture of the hurricane that I showed you near the beginning of the presentation, in some semblance, it's like we are currently in the eye of the hurricane. We have gone through about half of it, but there's still another half yet to go through. So with that, let's now talk about some solutions of how do we minimize the turbulence that we're going through. So, on the next slide, I'm presenting for you a list of 10 areas that I think we can work on to help minimize the turbulence. And the first of these, you may feel like, well, this is overly simplistic, but it's really far more important than you might give it credit, of updating your policies and procedures. I mean, obviously, if we've had to change a lot of the ways in which we're conducting business, maybe in some cases revamping entire business processes, you're going to have to change your policies and procedures to now map to the new way in which you're doing business. Also, the fact that if you have the majority of your employees now working from home, do you have policies and procedures covering how should that be performed properly and securely? Do you have minimum standards for securing the Wi-Fi in that home environment? Do you have minimum standards in place for how PII will be protected in that home environment? If the person has the ability to print to their home printer, we're now dealing with paper that may have PII on it. So how are you going to handle that? So has that been provided for in your policies and procedures? So, acceptable use policies. And I think too that as we're dealing with new ground that we're now covering, and the fact that we may be having to hire in some new people who are not as familiar with the way the organization may function. They don't have those many years of institutional knowledge. You have to recognize that policies and procedures, in effect, provide guardrails for those less experienced personnel and give them the ability to provide that consistency and repeatability in the execution of controls that they would not otherwise know how to do properly. So updating your policies and procedures, I think, is very important. So now moving on to number 2, performing a control rationalization review. And I bring this one up because, as I said earlier, a lot of business processes may have changed in the last 9 months. And as business processes change, that is going to impact your controls. Certain controls may no longer be relevant. On the flip side, there may be new processes that require new controls to be implemented. So with all of these changes, you really need to perform a control rationalization review to make sure that all of your controls are still relevant and that you have the right controls. So, this is something that I think is very key to mitigating some of the potential problems. So moving on now to number 3, automating control design and testing. And I think here, this is something that really we have underutilized over the years, but now with so many challenges taking place, the more we can automate controls, the more we can maybe help shift things so that although we may be short-staffed, we may have people on furlough, if the certain controls can take place, whether the staff is available to do them or not, automated controls generally have lower failure rates. They also free up people to do other work that you might not otherwise have time to do. Finally, I see things like, with these new automation tools like robotic process automation, or even just using simple scripting tools to automate controls. This provides you with the beginning of continuous monitoring. And continuous monitoring is going to greatly improve your control environment. So I would highly recommend, looking into things, maybe RPA may be a little bit out of reach at the moment. Maybe it's more just writing some SQL scripts or PowerShell scripts, things that can be done to automate certain controls that you would otherwise be having to assign an IT auditor to perform. So now on to number 4, increase security awareness training. And I know we've been performing security awareness training all along, but I think now it's more important than ever, because with the hackers increasing their level of attacks by tenfold or even 100-fold, it's so very important that our employees know how to react when they are faced with something like a phishing attack, or various other attacks where they may get this phone call from someone pretending to be the help desk, and how can they learn to recognize that this is not legitimate. So the security awareness training, highly important, and it should include contractors as well as full-time employees, because many times your contractors, they have access to confidential information every bit as much as a full-time employee. So make sure that your contractors are also going through this type of training. So let's go now to number 5. And this is implementing data loss prevention. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, you have certain employees who may be fearful that they're going to lose their jobs, they're going to be laid off. And as a result, they may be trying to offload, customer list, sales prospect list, or even intellectual property code that they've perhaps worked on as a developer. So we have to ensure that we have data loss prevention in place to ensure that this data is being protected. So definitely, I feel like many companies, more than not, I feel like most companies still have a good ways to go on implementing data loss prevention. In some cases, they've implemented it partially, but they've left out certain key groups that should have been included. Obviously, if you don't implement it across your entire organization, you're now leaving loopholes that may put you at risk. So now number 6, cross-training of key staff. And as we're looking at, furloughs and layoffs, it's very important to avoid having a single point of failure, especially for certain positions that are critical to the operation of certain controls, or to avoid placing yourself in a situation to where you have incompatible duties being performed by the same person. And one in particular comes to mind in the technology environment, and that is some of your older legacy applications that may be running on a mainframe, may actually be the old COBOL applications, and the fact that you may only have 2 or 3 people who are knowledgeable in this area, and guess what? They all fall within the same cohort age group in terms of being at greater risk of being infected by the COVID virus. So as you attempt to minimize your single points of failure, make sure you build in diversity so that you don't have backups, but all the backups are at the same level of risk. Just like if you had backup tapes, you would never store them inside the data center. You would store them at a separate location so that the threat that hits the data center doesn't also wipe them out. Similarly, make sure that you have a sufficiently diverse staff so that sickness or furlough doesn't hit all of the people who could be at risk here. So number 7, we could go to that, expanding your security assessments. And I think about vulnerability assessments. Many companies perform these on a quarterly basis, but given that we've gone from maybe 20 attacks a day to possibly in some industries maybe as much as 2,000, quarterly assessments may not be enough. And when I mention out of scope items, I know that some companies, when they contract for vulnerability assessments, they will say, well, don't scan the Unix system, or don't scan this legacy data warehouse system because it's no longer supported. It's running on a platform that is no longer patchable. And if you scan it, you may take it down. Well, the problem with that is those out of scope systems are probably how the hacker is going to break in to your environment, and they'll use that as the attack vector. So keeping in mind that vulnerability assessments very important, but then when you perform them, you need to act on the results. There have been way too many companies that I've seen that would perform the assessment and then not do anything with the results. When you get the results and you see, oh, we have these servers that haven't been patched in months, or in some cases over a year, that needs to be acted upon. You can't just ignore that. Secondly, penetration test. They do not replace vulnerability assessments, but they definitely augment them, and they provide a means for understanding where problems may lie. I know a while back I was involved in a penetration test where I met with the security director and told him, okay, we're going to be performing a penetration test next week. And I don't want you to tell your staff, but I want you to be aware just observe what you see happening and, be ready to intervene if there are problems or grave concerns. But, we'll be doing this next week. And then afterwards, I'll circle back with you and debrief you and see what you thought about things. So the next week came, we went in to a conference room. Our white hat ethical hacker plugged into a wall jack. And within an hour, she was harvesting IDs and passwords, got the ID and passwords for the controller, the payroll manager, among others. And so very surprising that security was that weak. So after that, I went and met with the security director. And I said, so what did you think? And he said, well, about what? And I said, well, we were able to penetrate your network. We were able to harvest IDs and passwords. And he was totally oblivious. And he was saying, well, but we have an intrusion detection system. It should have caught that. Well, what happened was the intrusion detection system had never been properly tuned. It was like a burglar alarm that had had its sensitivity turned down so low that nothing would set it off. So this is where penetration testing can really prove its worth by bringing to light situations that you wouldn't otherwise know about through a vulnerability assessment. And then finally, phishing and social engineering, that can be tested. You can have a simulated phishing attack, a simulated social engineering attack. And these are great ways to reinforce the awareness training that people are receiving, because otherwise it may go in one ear, out the other. I mean, I've heard of people falling for phishing attacks the same afternoon from when that morning they went through security awareness training. So if you don't test, then you won't necessarily make sure that they're really getting it and will start changing how they react to a potential attack. And it also, it provides valuable feedback so that you'll know how susceptible your organization may be to attack. It will allow you to go, wow, people don't seem to be getting it. Maybe we need to change the content of the security awareness training. So very important component. Let's go now to number 8. Another polling question.
Excellent. So for polling question number 3, has your organization performed an assessment of your technology and security risks since the start of the pandemic?
Okay, so we'll give everyone a moment to respond to this. And definitely with all the turbulence that's been going on, it raises the question of, is it time for a more up-to-date assessment of what your technology and security risks are? So we'll give everyone a few more seconds here. And yes, we have almost 60%, so 58% of you have performed an assessment of your technology and security risk this year, so since the start of the pandemic. So that's great. I am concerned about the other 42%, because as I've pointed out, so many of the risks have changed due to the increased risk velocity. So, I would counsel, it's probably something that you may want to look into in terms of making sure that your risk assessments are up to date given the increased velocity of risk. So now if we can go to number 8. And this is assessing your risks. So right on the money here. So, with all of the changes, making sure that you've not only assessed your own risk, but the risk posed by your vendors. Are you assessing your third-party risk with respect to cyber risk? And are they providing you with a SOC 2 Type 2 report? And if not, how do you know that your data is being adequately protected when it's being held by them? And then also your contracts with these vendors. Have they been updated to give you certain rights and responsibilities so that if something were to happen, can you point to the contract and say, well, in our amended contract, you agreed to abide by all of our security requirements. So ensuring all those contracts are up to date. So let's move on now to number 9. And this is injecting agility into your technical audits. Obviously, earlier we talked about a lot of the technical audits being deferred. So with agile auditing, are there ways in which you can make your audits, more streamlined, more compartmentalized, maybe not biting off as much in terms of scope, but still able to accomplish a lot of good things? So definitely injecting agility into your technical audits, leveraging resources, whether it's maybe even pulling in some of the security management staff and sharing information with them so that you can partner with them is something that's a possibility. But certainly being able to do more with less and having more point specific audits is something I think can help greatly. And then finally, let's go to number 10. And this is, you need to assess your cyber risk in 3 dimensions. And I alluded to this earlier, that it's not about just likelihood and magnitude of risk, but it's also risk velocity. It's the fact that so many risks are the speed at which they're changing is on the increase. You have new risks emerging more quickly than they once did, and the amount of time that the organization may need to adapt to that is much more challenging. So I think as you perform your cyber risk assessments, make sure that you're assessing all 3 dimensions, not only likelihood and magnitude, but also the velocity of risk. So with that, I think we are to the last slide and questions. Unfortunately, I think we're at the top of the hour, but if you will submit your questions to us, we will make sure that we get back to you in writing with answers to any questions that you may have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen. And that concludes our session. We hope to see you in our last session of the Jefferson Wells Digital Event Series. Have a great day.